clock on the wall tells us it's time for another episode of Learn, Teach, Lead, where we explore how educators just like you are using innovative instructional strategies, including how to leverage AI to improve teaching and learning.
Each week, we share real classroom stories, tools, and tips to help you save time, personalize instruction, and lead with confidence.
I'm Janine Nostrom, an elementary school principal.
And I'm Robin D'Angelo, an elementary school teacher. Let's get started with today's Friday debrief.
So I do believe we share a fabulous moment of the week this week, something that we are both extremely excited about. And that is that the article that we wrote kind of summarizing all of this work that we've been doing with AI has been accepted for NJPSA's Viewpoints magazine and is going to be in the spring edition. So
Yay!
About that. Yes.
Yay!
And you won't be able to miss the article because it's featured on the cover. So that was really quite a surprise and very exciting. And most of all, I hope it helps other schools, other building leaders, other teachers who want to replicate this work in their schools, because as we will unpack for you today, it really is quite remarkable, the impact that it's had on kids and their writing ability, or whatever, your area of focus is. I do think the process that we use has application. So that's our shared fabulous moment of the week.
I'm so excited, and it was such an honor to work with you, Janine, on this project. So it's just an amazing accomplishment, and we're super excited when the article comes out to share it with everybody.
Yep, absolutely.
Yay.
So we thought it would be a good idea this week to really take a look at just the impact that using teacher expertise and AI feedback has had on one student in particular, on their growth. So you have the luxury of looping with kids from, third grade to fourth grade.
Yes.
And so you picked one student, and you're going to kind of walk us through that student's progress, just so we can, not that we'll read every piece in detail or anything like that, but you can just pretty quickly eyeball it.
Yeah.
And of course, with the help of AI, you can quickly summarize, where the strengths and the areas of growth have been. But I thought it would be worth really taking a look at that as an illustration for people.
So this is a picture of my anchor chart that I have hanging in my room, because I like to keep it real. We teach the BMMME method: beginning, middle, and end, as they come up through the grades. And I love that because it's the common vocabulary that they take from kindergarten all the way up to fourth grade here. However, once we get to third and fourth, we start to get a little bit more detailed. For example, you'll see that, we talk about different hooks and how to get the reader, to be involved in the piece, how to start it, to draw them in, to hook them in. And here I have little notes like it's the blast off. Then we lead them down to build that tension, that rising action. We have our stop sign here to stretch those details. We have our action here. What's that big push? What's that, that resolution? What problem are you solving? What's the decision and choice? And then I love this posted at the end, and I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit, because it says, will the reader remember this forever, and why does it matter? So I just wanted to show you this before I talk about it a little bit with the students' writing, because I feel like this is important. I want to draw your attention over to here, where it says, don't just say it, be it. And this is something we found this time last year, if you can believe it. Probably, I want to say, thinking back, we found this about March, end of March, beginning of April last year. Our students' writing, even though they were doing a great job with this structure, was flat. It didn't have what was the body language that be, what was the facial expression of the characters, what was the characters internally feeling and thinking. So we had a slogan that we started this year in third grade, this time in third grade last year: don't just say it, be it. So every time they did this process, we put in this be it. Where did I get this be it? Because of course, that I riff with with ChatGPT and Magic Schools and, as a thinking partner. And this came directly from what my students needed when they were doing this narrative writing process. So from analyzing the data, I came up with, after riffing with ChatGPT, this little acronym to put into this narrative planning method. Are you following me?
Yes. So explain what the be it is.
Okay. So the be it is within this middle, they are going to put in sentences that show the body language of a character. For example, I doubled over in pain. So what was the character doing? They were not showing that when they were doing their first writings. What was the facial expression of the character? My jaw dropped to the floor in amazement. What was the facial expression? What was their internal feeling? My heart was pounding as quickly as the bunny was hopping across the lawn, So, just to get them to use those in there to give some of that creativity. And finally, what was my character thinking internally? I thought to myself, wow, this is a great math period. So putting that be it within this middle, we started this only about in late March, early April last year, when we were seeing that our writing was more of an event by event sequential story. It was kind of like, okay, here's my beginning, here's my middle, here's my next middle. It was kind of like they were just telling me the events with none of this in it. And they were doing everything correctly. They were following this BMMME, but there was no depth of character. There was no development of character. There was no creativity. They were just following the structure. So I just wanted to show you that before we go to the writing. Plus, I wanted to show you another one of our charts, because this is going to be important when I talk about the writing. Different things we look at when we're looking at students writing. One of the big ones that we were working on was how to hook the reader, whether we use an onomatopoeia, which is a sound word, whether they start with a setting or dialogue or a question or an action. We call it in my class, it's an hors d'oeuvre. It's a little hors d'oeuvre to your writing, because they want to give a little taste of what's in their writing, but they don't want to reveal the whole problem and solution and theme and lesson learned. So we call it a little, to hook the reader, we call these little hors d'oeuvres that we serve up in our writing. So with that said, I want to show you last year at this time, this is the same student that wrote this piece and this piece. One was a point of view. We were reading The One and Only Bob, and they had to write not in Bob's point of view, but in Bob's sister's point of view, Boss. And as you look at this, listen, for third grade, we were happy that they had the stamina to be writing. They were following that BMMME method, but it was falling short somewhere. And it was falling short of that, that development of the characters. Again, it was event by event. First this happened, then this happened, next this happened, then finally this happened, and it's like how they write in second grade. So they're doing their job. But as I'm using ChatGPT to score some of these non-biasedly, we were noticing that they were not getting threes. They were not meeting the benchmark of where we had to be in third grade. So we said, what can we do based on the data of my class to put in that development of character? So it's not just...
And you could see, Robin, just by looking at this first piece, it's not long enough to fully develop the MMM in the middle, right? Those three parts of the middle.
Right.
But you can also see that the student is starting to approximate, creating a strong lead, starting with, yelp, I cried in pain, someone help me. So incorporating that dialogue, sound words, things like that.
Right.
So the student is applying the structure to the best of the student's ability in this case. And you can see that it doesn't happen immediately, right? You need to scaffold this and give them a little bit of time to play. So we can't expect it to be absolutely perfect the first time, but we can look and say, of what I have already taught them, what are they applying?
Exactly. And the important thing is that they were understanding the process of the structure. They just didn't have the full development of it.
Right.
Yet our standards and you know, our benchmarks that we need them held accountable to and meet are quite rigorous.
Right.
And you know, so
and if you read this piece, Robin, like when I read it, I found myself at the end, like, you know, I'm familiar with the one and only Bob, but if you weren't privy to the class discussion and the prompt and the story, the one and only Bob, this paragraph would be very confusing.
Right.
But for the student in the context of where they were, for just trying to wrap their mind around the structure, you know, it was a perfect starting place.
Absolutely. It's April of 2025. This was last year. I'm going to just correct that so we don't confuse anybody. Okay. This is when we just added the be it. When we call it be it, right? That BEIT that we kind of were talking about in the beginning, that transferred over even more. So for teachers out there that, you know, have one strategy, that might not be cookie cutter for every kid. You know, it's a good thing to try different things. Even if it's the same concept, try to name it something different. Try a different acronym, because truthfully, that's how you're going to start reaching all of your students, by personalizing that instruction. Now, this was a whole class, be it, kind of like we put that into the whole class, but you can even start to see, again, they have that onomatopoeia, but they're starting to talk about like how the characters were, how their expressions were, what they were doing. You know, you're starting to talk a little bit more about, you know, how the characters were feeling.
Yeah.
Right? They're threatening to quit. Like a little bit more of that development of these ideas. And this was almost instantaneously when I tell you that once we put this be it in there, again, they still had that structure of BMMME, but we can start to see the development. So this was this time last year. Fast forward 1 year from then, I have the same student this year in my class. And I have to tell you, with keeping with that structure, and again, you know, when we're talking about writer's workshop, we're talking about finding students' voice and finding what drives their creativity. When we give them this structure, it's almost a foundation in which they can build their story upon. Now, our concern, and we had this valid concern last year, Janine, that, well, what if it's a lot of structure and they really are not, they're only sticking to the structure and not finding their writer's voice. We kind of talked about that when we were looking at these, you know, planning structures and things that they follow, because as a teacher, we want them to eventually be a creative writer, right? So looking at that structure a year later, this one particular student, and many of mine, do not need that structure sentence by sentence anymore. They don't need that first, next, then, finally. Looking at this, they're now able to build upon it, because using AI as a thinking partner, I targeted the instruction so that I can put these strategies in so that they can take this and go to the next level. Are you ready for the students writing this year?
Yes, but before you turn the page, I do
Okay.
want to say that a tremendous amount of instruction happened between last year and this year. Daily instruction, where you gave them many opportunities to practice with what they needed. So those personalized pathways, so students could, like if a student was struggling with a strong opening. Well, their personalized pathway was to, lots of opportunities to do strong openings. And so this daily instruction, lots of talking, lots of reading of exemplars, all of these many opportunities for them to practice, help them internalize the framework and then play around in the framework until we get to what you're going to show us next.
Right. And, that framework became intentional.
Mm-hmm.
It became crafted and it became designed for them as a writer.
And the reason I want to look at that one is because the student used the setting as the opening.
Right. Isn't that amazing?
Where I had noticed in the other pieces that the student was sticking with the onomatopoeia, right? Those sound words. And that's what a lot of kids will do. That's the easiest one to do, I think. But the setting is a little more sophisticated. Now you're really unfolding a story for someone. And so by February, a year later, this student is showing a little more sophisticated lead right off the bat.
I highlighted some of this because these words, obviously, I mean, just the level of vocabulary. Now, I could tell you what I did with why this student is really using sophisticated vocabulary. When I looked at these stories last year, one of the personalized pathways and targeted instructions for my class was a vocabulary wall.
Right.
And it was a vocabulary wall based on vocabulary that we needed to know that was third grade level, but more descriptive vocabulary. That's one of the areas we found that they were not, they were really kind of struggling with. And you can see, like, we use now words like magnificent, admired, ventured. I mean, these are sophisticated words, but I feel like once I knew what they needed to put a piece like this together, I was able to build that into my 10-minute do nows.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Even expressions, swallowed by the dark clouds. I mean, that paints a picture.
Mm-hmm.
Darkest of deep forests. So these were 10-minute do nows. I knew that they were having a little bit of trouble with, really, again, that show not tell, that imagery that we call it, and we did a lot of work on that over the last year. But the student,
what did a 10-minute do now look like, for example, to address that?
So, for example, for vocabulary, we do a word of the day where we pick one word that we write on an index card. The definition and the part of speech is in the front of the card. And the back of the card would be the definition and a sentence. And they're building vocabulary rings in my class that they're now going to travel to 5th grade with, so that when they need a word for a story or, whatever they're doing in school, they can go back to these descriptive words and then they'll have them on that ring that they're familiar with, how to spell, how to use in a sentence. And from there, another 10-minute do now would be put these words into a complex or compound sentence.
Okay. So this is isolated practice, right?
Yes.
So you're taking vocabulary that you think would enrich their writing.
Correct.
And you're teaching it to them directly. You're giving them an opportunity then to review sentence types by, write a simple sentence using these words, write a compound sentence. Now, this might sound very old school, but if you think about how that scaffolded practice then translated into their, their internalization of the whole framework for writing, it really served them well. So that's great.
Absolutely. And, and I truly believe that the more students have to pull from their, backpack of tricks, the more tricks they will pull out.
Sure.
So if you have, if they have a good sense of vocabulary, then they're going to be able to use it. A big thing with my students sometimes is they don't know where to start. They don't know that starting point. And that's why we have these planning methods, because this is where we're starting. But
Right.
where do we go from there? So based on, analysis, and I have to say, based on analysis, build upon what you're starting with, because that's when you're going to get pieces such as this with amazing, I mean, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Like just amazing tricks that they can pull out of their backpack that they could use within their writing. And I highlighted this as well, because if you notice on here, we did a lot with theme this year. The band was back. Nice fun ending, but not a lesson learned, not a hope for the future, but really like a nice cute ending for third grade. But in fourth grade, the myth teaches us that you should always be the light in the dark and never dim yourself. That's a theme. That's more of a developed theme. And, we did a lot of practice with our themes as well, because they were using themes as brave, or sparkle, or courageous, but those were not themes, those were character traits. So when we're scoring writing, they were getting less than benchmark for their theme. So to develop this using, again, that non-biased point of view. Oh, okay, my class needs to work on theme, let's backtrack a little bit and let's all work on theme. And now the theme is really evolving.
Yeah, and if you just look at this, you can see just by the volume that, there's a lot more volume here, as you would expect, a year later, that the volume increases.
Right.
But I mean, I know we're not reading them aloud,
Yeah.
but just in terms of comprehension and cohesive, it's not a random, loosely tied together connection of thoughts. This is a better organized story. It's easier to follow. It's more fully developed. A lot of times when you ask kids to tell you a story, they'll tell you all these details, but then when they sit down to write, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, they've let half of it's in their head and the pieces of it are on the paper. In this case, you can really see the story as the author is envisioning it unfold on the page. Absolutely. But my favorite story is the next one.
Your favorite story is next, because it's about you, Miss Nostrum.
And about you.
And about me, yes, yes. So this was February.
Yes.
Now the one coming up is more recent. The students started to write this in this month in March, but this is not the only page. And I really hope I can show this on my camera. I'm going to try. It's 1, 2,
amazing,
and 3. I don't know if I could show it all. It's too long. 1, 2, and 3 pages.
That's okay.
Here's the third all the way over here.
Well, a significant increase in the volume.
Yes.
And obviously we don't have time to read the whole thing, but the story is absolutely crystal clear, what the action of the story is. It has a clear conflict, an internal conflict. The character is struggling with her conscience because she took something that she knew that, didn't belong to her and she shouldn't have taken, and the message at the end is very clear. Yes. There's dialogue, there's sound words. It's just beautifully written. I think any 5th grade teacher would be happy to have a piece of writing like this. Same kid 1 year later.
Of course. And I highlighted a few things because, just the level of, thinking, cracked open box that had old files pouring out of it. As we're talking again about that they're picturing that in their mind. What is their body language doing? What are they seeing? I wonder, there's that internal thinking. Here's those words that we work on each day, those description words. Here's that internal thinking. Should I lie and say I just found it, or should I do the right thing and tell the truth? Like, what's that What's that character thinking? When I used AI to kind of think of what does my class need a year ago, and that was put in, this is the result. And here's my theme work. When you do the right thing, good things will happen. And sometimes you have to let go of something, even if you don't want to. Like, there's my theme. It's not just, oh, we're happy or we're sad. So these things that we're looking at in this student's writing, although the volume is tremendous, but my cheeks basically turned into tomato. External description of the character. Every part of my body felt sweaty, and I felt the guilt turn into the pit of my stomach. There's that internal feeling. So they're using that be it that we were talking about, and that really was a successful jump for my students. And what is this based on? It's based on the data that we saw last year to get them to this point.
Right, right, absolutely. So really we started step one for them was to give them the structure, right? To really go, I probably skipped ahead, but
That's
I
okay.
found this part interesting to
I'll
me.
follow you. You on this page?
I'm on how starting with the structure helps students find their writer's voice. And, full disclosure, we riff with ChatGPT continually. So, this ChatGPT helped us organize this, but we've been talking about this. Sometimes I think it's funny how ChatGPT knows exactly where our conversations are going.
I know.
But we had talked at length, riffing with ChatGPT, and just among ourselves, we had talked about, is it the right thing to do to give them such a scaffolded and structured writing plan? We were worried about that, as you said, it being too formulaic. But really, that was the necessary step one to help them get control of that structure. The more they practiced with it, and then we expanded upon it, then it just became part of how they think before they write. And they needed that so desperately. They didn't know how to think through a developed essay. So how could we expect them to write it? It's almost like asking someone to play music without ever teaching them to read notes or what chords look like. So I just think going through the whole structure you have listed there, step one is the structure. Step two is control of the structure. Step three was adding in the be it. Step four was the structure becomes invisible. Now every kid's piece of writing doesn't sound the same anymore. Right. And their student voice emerges. And I think that was just tremendous.
And it's funny, one of the teachers came up to me today and she said, what's really crazy? She said, I was giving my third graders a instruction, and I said, okay, describe the character. And you know what one of them said to me? What does that mean, describe the character? And I thought about it for a minute and I said, well, maybe they don't really know what describe the character means. And I think that's what happened here.
Yeah.
We always say, oh, yeah, describe what the character's feeling. But really, what does that mean? That means, what are they doing? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What do you see them doing? So when you make it a little bit, you might have to make it a little clearer for them. My class last year, they imagery is a big word. But when you break it down into exactly what's, kind of sentences you have to put in there, that might be helpful for some students, again, with that scaffolding approach.
Right, right. I mean, again, there was just so much to unpack here because I will say that, every student is different. This particular student already had a pretty good command of spelling and mechanics. I will say that, like, even if you look at the student's first piece, it is very it has conventional spelling. It basically has, pretty decent punctuation and capitalization. But for students who didn't have that, then their daily personalized instruction leaned into whatever skills they needed to develop. So it's just so easy not easy. It's not easy. You make it look easy, Robin, but it's not easy. I take that back. It's just so helpful to get the feedback from AI and combine it with your own expertise to make these personalized pathways, because it just yields such great results.
Right. And I just wanted to share with you, I just ran their latest narrative and 90% were at level 3 or above in benchmark for narrative writing. So looking at these phases of giving them the structure, giving them that strategy and them finding the voice. It could almost be like repeat. You know, you think of like grammar, give them the structure you would like them to use, give them an extra strategy, let them find their voice of it, and then repeat with the next one, complex sentences. Give them the structure, the strategy, let them find their voice, and repeat with onomatopoeias, you know, so whatever it is to follow that is really targeting that instruction. And that's where we found a lot of success.
Yes. So Robin, do you have a power move for us this week?
I have a power move this week. I actually would say for all of the teachers out there, stay with this, you know, stay with the structure, stay with the planning that you have, stay with your curriculum path, but use that, analyze the student data, target that instruction, and build upon that, just like I said, because that's where you're going to see that intentional shift of what can the student do and where is the student going, and then what can the student do after that. Targeted progress, progress monitoring and targeted instruction, because that's the key. You know, to teach a concept, we have been teaching narrative since kindergarten, but yet every year we still repeat the narrative process. So we want them to really hang on to those fun acronyms, though, that little bit of structure, so that they can continue to build upon that.
Absolutely. And I think my power move of the week would be to encourage teachers or administrators out there to take one student and take a piece or two of their writing from last year, and take a piece or two of their writing from this year, and just read through and see if you can identify their progression. How are things going? What are they improving in? What are their strengths? And then run all of those pieces through your favorite large language model and see what feedback it gives you and where you should focus your attention. I think it's a very interesting exercise to do. I think I always find it to be quite enlightening.
Not only for me as a teacher, it's an amazing reflection to look back on, but I showed the student today the progress that they made, because, they work so hard every day, and I want them to see that they're progressing. Because when you're looking at your writing, you're like, oh, I used to write like that. I don't write any different than third grade, but they don't realize where they came from and where they are now. And that student was like, that's my writing from last year. And I go, yeah, and it was really good last year. I said, it was good. You were in third grade. It was great. I said, but look at how far you've come. And that student was like, oh my gosh. She's like, wow, I can't even imagine that's how. And let me tell you, she left with the biggest smile on her face, because she felt proud of the work that she did. So it's not only a reflection, but it's a confidence builder as well.
That's great. And I give the student extra points because her story was all about my retirement. So
yes,
she gets brownie points.
Wait, and not wanting you to go. You forgot the theme. No.
Yes, which was just so sweet. Well, folks, that old clock on the wall tells us it's time to wrap up another episode of Learn, Teach, Lead, our Friday debrief. We've shared a few lessons, unpacked a few stories, and maybe sparked a few new ideas for your classroom or your leadership journey.
As always, we hope you take what you've learned, teach it forward, and lead with purpose. Thanks for spending part of your week with us. We'll see you next time.